On the 17th of December 1985, a police officer on duty in Bradford, West Yorkshire, noticed a car parked suspiciously. When he began to follow the car, it sped off into the night.
As the car speeds away, the police become ever more convinced that something's wrong with it and with the driver.
After a high-speed chase, the driver crashed into a traffic island, and police managed to arrest him.
Why had he tried to get away from us? Had he stolen the car? He came out with a reply which I will never forget, and that reply was, "Okay lads, you've got me for murder."
The driver was 40-year-old George Naylor, and on the back seat of the car was the body of Deborah Kershaw. The 22-year-old had tragically been strangled just moments earlier.
They looked at his record and realised they had not only a man who had admitted to killing someone, but somebody who had for many, many years proved to be a dangerous individual.
A routine traffic stop that escalated into a high-speed car chase had, incredibly, unveiled George Naylor as one of Britain's most evil killers. When George Naylor was convicted of murder in February 1997, it brought an end to his reign of terror. It was a relief to the women he'd spent a lifetime torturing, and closure for the investigators who'd hunted him down.
George Naylor was one of the few truly evil people I ever met in 31 years of being a police officer in Bradford.
I'm absolutely convinced in my own mind that any time Naylor had his liberty, then women were not safe.
Naylor targeted vulnerable women throughout his life, never showing remorse for what he'd done.
What always saddens me is that these girls just became a headline. Naylor became the story, and the girls are almost forgotten.
There were many opportunities to put Naylor away for life, but he managed to evade justice for years.
Naylor's only conscience was about himself. He had no sense of anybody else, particularly when it came to women. He was a brute, a cold, calculating brute who killed because he could.
This killer's story begins in West Bowling, Yorkshire, in 1944.
We don't know a great deal about George Naylor's early life. We know it was troubled, but we know very little about his parents or indeed siblings.
Even as a child, George Naylor showed his violent tendencies. He used violence to manipulate others. It wasn't just that he couldn't control it, it was his power.
He's using violence to gain status so that people will maybe steer clear of him, respect him, all of those kinds of things, and to give himself a little bit of power and control.
As a young person, his violence was noticed, and it escalated to the point where, as a teenager, he was sent to Borstal. Firstly, a series of petty crimes, robbery and theft. But then his crimes seemed to get more and more extreme and more violent.
When Naylor was just 17, he committed his first serious offence.
He's broken into a house where the resident was an elderly female. He's beaten the female occupant up with his fists. He's threatened her with a gun. He's stolen her property and her money.
Now that's a really serious offence. He'd been building up to violence for quite a long time. he also used that violence, committed that robbery on a woman. And that suggests it's that bully thing about him where he's going to target somebody who's maybe weaker than him, easy to overpower.
By the summer of 1967, the now 22-year-old Naylor already had a long list of criminal charges to his name. But that didn't affect his luck with the ladies.
Naylor was a charmer. Throughout his life, he managed to charm 2 women to becoming his partner. But very quickly, they began to realize that he had a very different soul to the charming man they had fallen for. And he was violent towards them.
George Naylor met his first partner in a pub, and she literally fell for his charm. He was, like his character or not, capable of being truly charming. The 2 of them went on to have 2 children together.
What I can absolutely guarantee is that relationship had problems from the very beginning. People like Naylor are inherently manipulative. This is a man who forces what he wants.
Naylor's first partner was subject to 6 years of physical and sexual abuse.
When you're experiencing coercive control from a partner, and Naylor was undoubtedly coercively controlling, the one thing you can't do is leave, escape, because all of those things that he's been doing to her are to trap her right where she is, because he believes very strongly he owns her, he possesses her.
She had desperately tried to seek help. They'd had children together, and she'd contacting social services to say, I need to get away. He is violent. I am frightened. And I think the thing that strikes me, the response was so typical of that era. They told her, better a bad father than none at all.
In 1973, his partner managed to get away from him, but Naylor refused to let her go.
He wanted to frighten her back to him. He would break into her house, he would attack her, he was stalking her. She must have been absolutely terrified.
In 1974, Naylor was living in a flat in Bradford, where his crimes took an even darker turn.
He broke into a neighbour's flat, a block in which he lived, and he donned a mask. And he attacked a 60-year-old woman viciously and raped her. He'd set upon her just because he could, and because it was another example of his growing pathological hatred of women.
He committed some very serious, the most horrific acts against this woman. Stripped her naked, beat her, bit her, he raped her, and he committed serious, depraved sexual acts.
This, even for him, is an escalation. I think the wearing of the mask shows the premeditation. He knew what he was going to do. He knew that it was going to be a serious offence, and he did not want this lady to be able to identify him.
As a police investigation began, Naylor seemed determined to do whatever it took to cover up his crimes.
He had the gall to go back to the scene of his crime and play the part of worried neighbour, concerned friend, asking if there was anything that he could do for her. He knew that if he went back, if fibres from his clothes were found, if his fingerprints were found, he could say, well, of course, I merely went to check that this poor woman was okay.
It appeared that Naylor had tried to outwit the police, but there was one thing he'd overlooked. Shards from the very window he'd broken in order to access the flat were found in his coat pocket, which would lead police to eventually arrest and charge Naylor.
There were also some traces, fibres, from his pullover on her pyjamas. In the end, those small things caught Naylor. He hadn't expected them.
Naylor was sentenced to 15 years for the horrific attack, but was released before serving his full term.
The rape was brutal, it was horrific, and yet he served less than 10 years. Within weeks of his release from prison, he was hunting on the streets of Bradford.
He would have been honing those skills of manipulation and showing his status and gaining status for a decade. And then we let him out on the streets again, and he's not going to stop.
In 1985, George Naylor walked out of prison a free man, but he was far from rehabilitated. Just 8 weeks after his release, he would escalate from brutal rapist to cold-blooded killer. In 1985, 40-year-old convicted rapist George Naylor was released onto the streets of West Yorkshire.
Bradford in the 80s and 90s was only just recovering from the reign of terror that Peter Sutcliffe had caused. But during that time, women selling sex hadn't stopped. What had changed was the reason for it. By the time Naylor was prowling the streets, drugs and alcohol had become the main reason. So, if a young woman became addicted, that was a way to feed her addiction.
The sex worker community was forced to operate in the shadows. Lindsay Walton is CEO of a charity trying to raise awareness of their stories.
Street sex workers often find they need to operate in areas where they are a bit more off the beaten track. And obviously that then increases the danger. You have to make very quick decisions on if you trust someone.
The vulnerability of sex workers was about to be exposed in the most horrific way. In the early hours of the 17th of December 1985, police officer Mark Plovey was on duty in the red light district when something caught his eye.
I saw a car. It was parked off City Road in an area which I found suspicious. The car, to my mind, was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So they begin to follow the car, and then the car speeds up and they give chase, literally, through Bradford.
The distance is starting to increase. It's starting to pull away from me, which was concerning. The driver actually made a right turn at 70 plus miles an hour. So you can imagine what happened then. And the vehicle actually came to a rest in the middle of this traffic island. Much to my surprise, the driver's door was flung open and the male's out and he's off running.
The driver of the car continued to run, scaling numerous walls, desperate to outrun the police, closing in behind him.
It took the officers some time to catch the individual on foot. And eventually they tackled him and brought him to the ground to arrest him.
The man the police had captured was 40-year-old George Naylor.
We arrested him on suspicion of stealing the car, but then we noticed that he was sweating absolutely profusely. He was emotional, he was agitated, he was crying, he was sobbing.
They've just had a chase. They know that this person has got something to hide. They then present as emotionally strange as well. It's just going to keep layering over with the suspicions that they might have.
Why had he tried to get away from us? Had he stolen the car? And then he came out with a reply which I will never forget. And that reply was, "Okay lads, you've got me for murder. I'm glad you've caught me." Which prompted me, of course, to ask him, "What do you mean by that?" To which he replied, "There's a dead prostitute in the back of the car."
That one sentence says so much about him. There's a dead prostitute in the back of the car. It's almost saying to the police, it's not the most serious offence you've ever seen. And I think that reveals about him how absolutely awful he is as a human being.
A routine traffic stop had intensified rapidly and was now looking like the beginnings of a full-blown murder investigation.
I had a look in the back of the car and I saw the body of a female. There was blood around her head and face. Her legs were behind the front passenger seat down in the well, and her torso was on the back seat behind the driver's seat.
When police looked into the name George Naylor, they discovered a man with a long history of offences.
We put him in the back of the transit van, and then I started to take a closer look at him, and I could see that he'd got blood all over his hands and he'd got blood all down the white jumper that he was wearing.
Naylor would have gone through quite a few different emotions. He is trapped and he does not like being trapped, so he's going to be looking for any chink in the armour to get out of that entrapment.
Naylor was handcuffed in the day cell. He became increasingly agitated, and then he ran to the toilet and he shoved both hands down the toilet bowl and began to very, very quickly rinse the blood off his hands. He then turned to myself and said, "That will make it more difficult for you, you bastards."
But the police were already one step ahead of Naylor. Mark recognised the victim from his work in the red light district. She was 22-year-old sex worker Deborah Kershaw.
It's really sad that we know so little about Deborah, and I think that does speak to the way that sex workers were viewed at the time. That she wasn't notable in society enough for them to keep a record of this wonderful woman's life and what she meant to people.
Sex workers are very, very often targeted by men who specifically want to hurt and kill women. It's not the fact that they're sex workers, it's the fact that they have access to them. He wanted a woman, and he got a woman.
Naylor had been caught red-handed and was swiftly charged with murder. But faced with prison time, he started to change his story.
He was going to put the blame on his victim. Deborah, he said, had become aggressive, uncooperative when he'd said to her that he didn't have enough money. His excuse was she died after he'd put her in a headlock. In other words, the killer was blaming the victim for her own death.
This is a man who will try every possible escape route with no moral code whatsoever. No shame, no remorse, no guilt, no nothing. Just me. I want to get out of here.
The trial began at Leeds Crown Court. The jury weren't allowed to know about Naylor's violent past. They had to make a judgment based purely on the evidence of Deborah's murder.
The post-mortem on Deborah said that Deborah had been strangled. and the strangulation was done by both hands around the neck. Repeated gripping over and over, which in essence caused a patchwork of bruising around the neck from the front to the back.
When Naylor gets to trial, the defence make a great play of the fact that Deborah had a very frail windpipe and suggest that it was perhaps their client who's suggesting it was a tragic accident during consensual sex.
In a crushing blow to prosecutors and the family of Deborah Kershaw, the jury believed Naylor's version of events and found him guilty not of murder, but of manslaughter.
That was a huge error of judgment. Naylor's obviously a really clever performer to persuade a jury that somehow his crimes were not as bad as they were. That he was not a murderer, but an unfortunate killer who'd made a mistake. And that's unforgivable.
It was, I suppose, an indication to him that he could get away with whatever he wanted.
After the verdict, the jury were made aware of Naylor's criminal background for the first time.
It was clear to me, looking across at the 12 members of the jury, that they were ashen, white-faced, indeed quite shocked when they heard about his character and background. And I have no doubt in my mind that perhaps as some of them returned home, they obviously thought, perhaps we've got this one wrong.
Despite escaping a murder conviction, George Naylor was still sentenced to life in prison. And even behind bars, the rage remained inside of him.
At one point, he made threats that should he ever get out of prison for killing Deborah, he would pay me a visit. That's putting it politely.
He's trying to assert his status. You're not better than me, so you better be careful. When I get out of here, I'm going to hurt you. Throughout his life, he's used fear to try and control people. Just the same old, same old. He had nothing else, really.
Just 1 year into his imprisonment, Naylor appealed his sentence and went before a new judge. His legal team claimed that he no longer posed a threat to the public.
Staggeringly, especially when you look at his previous history and now know what was to follow, the judge agreed with him. He said virtually that he posed no threat to the general public, that threat was barren. And in fact, his sentence was reduced to just 11 years.
Well, I don't want to use expletives, but of course I was furious. That must have been heartbreaking for the family, friends and loved ones of Deborah.
Police thought they had finally put George Naylor behind bars for life. But in a stunning turn of events, after serving just 7.5 years, he was out again. No longer just a rapist, but a practiced killer. Emboldened by the legal system, Naylor was a free man and primed to kill again. In 1993, 48-year-old George Naylor was once again a free man, with a record for both rape and manslaughter. But prison hadn't slowed him down. Behind bars, he'd kept up his talent for charm, and had even left prison with something no one expected: a new wife.
He managed to persuade a woman that he was a man who should be and could be loved. He was actually married in prison. The woman who married him knew nothing of his past, but this was not a man who could be tamed.
When Naylor left prison, he moved with his new wife to South Shields in the northeast.
she thought he was a nice person, a different person to the one he actually was. And unfortunately, when he was released, she found out very quickly what a dangerous person Naylor was.
Eventually, his wife was forced to get a restraining order on him. He tried to strangle her. She thought she was going to die, and the marriage was over. Naylor moved back to Bradford with tragic consequences.
On the 9th of June 1995, police were called to the home of 18-year-old Maureen Stepan, where her boyfriend had found her dead.
A murder inquiry was launched. I was a detective sergeant working at the local police station in Bradford, so I was part of the investigation team.
The investigation began by learning more about the 18-year-old.
Maureen was a young girl, an attractive girl, came from a good family. We met her mother and father. But like many young people, she eventually got involved in drugs.
Her parents tried desperately to cope. They went to social services and they said, please help us. She was sent to establishments in London and elsewhere in the country, but she never could quite kick the addiction.
Once she'd become addicted to heroin, then it was incredibly difficult to fund that addiction. Working in the sex trade was just one way of actually funding that heroin addiction. Frequently, she was found walking the streets of Bradford and looking for customers.
On the night of her murder, Maureen had been working on the street. Investigators needed to figure out who she'd met that night.
We just simply had other accounts from her friends who had said she was standing on this particular street corner. A car pulled up, she got in, she went off, but then she came back and we saw her again later on. But then we realised after a while that after one particular meeting, then she disappeared. Clearly this would seem to be when she met her killer, went back to her house and was killed.
Police had a timeline, but nobody could identify her abductor. It was a dead end. Investigators went back to Maureen's body. Maybe it could provide clues as to who had brutally murdered her.
Her clothing had been removed and she'd been strangled with her own tights. We saw cigarette burns on her body, so she had been mutilated after death. It was clearly a sick individual who had done that to somebody.
That shows to me a lot of rage, a lot of hatred towards what the victim represents, women. He absolutely wanted to show you are nothing. I am better. I am above you. You are literally nothing to me.
Investigators appealed to the public for help in catching this violent killer. Someone came forward saying they had information about a local resident, George Naylor.
George had recently visited a friend of his and had asked him if he would wash some clothing. Now, that was very unusual. Why would George Naylor need someone else to wash his clothing? So he became a very strong person of interest from our point of view.
It's hardly a surprise that Naylor becomes a possible suspect. He's known as a sex offender, he's killed before, so he gets onto a shortlist very quickly.
As police investigated the now 50-year-old George Naylor, they found more and more red flags.
We discovered that he had fled Bradford, where he had a house. That in itself was unusual.
In fleeing, he drew even more attention to himself. It's one of those panic decisions that really He should have thought about it more.
Police discovered that Naylor hadn't gone far. He was back at his estranged wife's home in South Shields. On the 16th of June 1995, the police felt that Naylor was a strong enough suspect to arrest him for the murder of Maureen Stepan.
Having arrested many people, his reaction was quite unusual. He didn't panic, didn't protest, he wasn't shocked. One of the first things he asked is he wanted to go to the toilet. Now, something about George's manner and demeanour at that stage told me that something strange was going to happen. He turned his back on me and he began to urinate. I could see he was fumbling around and something strange was going on. George had a load of pills and he was trying to get those pills out and to swallow them. So we very quickly disabled him, overpowered him, removed the pills from his hands and took them away from him and placed him in handcuffs.
Now in police custody, Naylor denied knowing Maureen and said he had nothing to do with her murder. Detectives needed to find evidence to link him to Maureen. They started by searching his marital home.
We noticed that the house had a telephone answering system. A lot of calls coming into the house were logged. So we were able to see the numbers that had been ringing the house. When we spoke to his partner, she informed us that on the night of the offence, she had gone out with a group of friends and he was not happy about that. In fact, he was furious. While she was out, he kept on ringing and ringing her house to find out where she was. But that gave us a little gold mine of evidence because all those numbers that we found on the telephone answering machine were Bradford numbers. That allowed us to prove that George was in the red light area, very close to where Maureen Stepan had been last seen and had actually been working that night.
Naylor was forced to admit that he had been in the Bradford area, but it still wasn't enough to charge him. Fortunately, the police were able to retrieve the clothing that he'd been wearing that night.
It had been washed, but they were able to actually still find enough material to make a test on. They were able to say that the jeans that George Naylor had dropped off to be washed had the blood of Maureen Stepan on the knee.
Investigators now had compelling evidence that linked Naylor not just to the area, but directly to Maureen's murder.
We sort of forced him into a corner where he had to admit actual contact with Maureen. George's account changed dramatically. And then what he said was, I did meet somebody that fits the description of Maureen Stepan on the night in question. She did get into my car and we did have sex, but I did not kill her and I did not go back to her house.
Typically for Naylor, even when he's confronted by really clear evidence, DNA, the phone calls, all the rest, he's still trying to wriggle out of it. He's still trying to say, no, it's a misunderstanding, it wasn't me. As you would expect from a man whose vanity knew few bounds.
Detectives were certain they had their man, and on the 17th of June, George Naylor was charged with the murder of Maureen Stepan. The police had evidence to show a man with a history of violence, angry at his wife and a young woman who simply crossed his path.
Maureen was obviously desperate that night. She was still on the streets at 2:30 in the morning. It was then that Naylor approached her and asked her for sex. He had spent the evening in a local pub. He was getting more and more angry. He tried to contact his wife to persuade her to take him back. And by the time his car pulled up where Maureen stood in a usual spot in Bradford, he was fuming.
What he's suffering in his mind is massive injustice meted out on him by a woman. We have this massive entitlement and status issue. He's going to take it out on another woman.
He was very jealous, and therefore, by picking up a person working in the sex trade, he was going to get his own back. He saw Maureen, George picked her up, and then they ended up going back to the house.
She will have had seconds to make a decision as to whether it was safe enough. And with certain individuals, like Naylor, I think that if she hadn't got in willingly, he probably would have forced her in anyway.
Police were confident that they had a watertight case against Naylor. But he'd managed to evade justice once before. Investigators were desperate to make sure that history wouldn't repeat itself. But George Naylor was going to do whatever it took to try and get away with murder again. In 1997, George Naylor was already a convicted killer and rapist. And now he once again faced prison for the murder of 18-year-old Maureen Stepan. The trial began at Sheffield Crown Court, with Maureen's family in attendance.
Now, I did meet Maureen's family at court. We did everything we could to comfort them, to give them support, to assist them in whatever way we could.
Families want to know the facts, even if those facts are incredibly painful. And to add to that, you've got somebody who you know has done it, all the evidence is pointing that way, who's going to start throwing out every kind of defence. Blame the victim, make himself seem like a wonderful, lovely person, and all the time they've just got to sit there in silence and try and maintain dignity. So hard.
By 1997, the law had changed, and unlike his trial over a decade earlier, the jury were now allowed to hear a lot more about Naylor's violent past.
With Naylor, his two offences were so incredibly similar in so many ways. The MO, the way that the women died. We can say, jury, you need to know about this.
The prosecution laid bare Naylor's history of raping and killing, and Maureen's DNA on his trousers left him nowhere to hide. Finally, George Naylor was found guilty of murder. Justice had, seemingly, been served. On the 6th of February 1997, he was given a life sentence.
However, Naylor was an arch manipulator, not just of women, but of the system. And he appealed that murder conviction. He'd been successful before.
He was a man willing to just keep trying and trying and trying. Worked for him in the past. Worth a punt, I think, is probably how he would have seen it.
In 1999, Naylor was granted a retrial on the grounds that the jury should not have been told about his previous manslaughter conviction.
On this trial, we weren't allowed to mention anything about the previous offence where Deborah Kershaw had been killed. It went simply and solely on the evidence relating to Maureen Stepan.
The prosecution needed to try a new tactic to convince the jury of Naylor's bad character. Both his estranged wife and the mother of his children were brave enough to speak against him.
Naylor's previous partners testify that he is a violent man towards women, that he is not of good character, that he is, in a sense, hiding in plain sight. He looks charming and nonchalant and ordinary, and yet he truly isn't.
Both women were certain of one thing. If Naylor was released, then he would kill again. After yet another trial, the jury found Naylor guilty for the second time. He tried to escape justice, but he was ordered to serve at least 20 years behind bars. For Maureen's family, the seemingly endless trials were finally over.
I do believe that there was a big sense of relief at the end, that this was finally the end of this saga. You can never forget your family members that have been killed like this, but people have to move on, have to try and build a life again. But knowing that the killer's been caught and properly punished is a big factor in moving on and getting over and grieving properly.
Naylor had a significantly negative impact on so many different lives, and those are just the ones we know about. So this is a man who was trashing his way through life, hurting everybody who came into his path.
Naylor didn't appear to see his victims as people. It was as if Maureen's and Deborah's lives meant nothing to him.
It's vital that we give a voice for Maureen and Deborah. They need to be heard. They are someone's best friend, someone's mum. They are good people and do not deserve to be thrown away in the way that society treats them.
Often these men, these killers, these vicious, violent, sadistic men, excuse their behaviour by saying, "Oh, well, she was only working the streets." I always like to switch it around. To say Naylor was the weak, pathetic individual here. The girls were sad victims of the circumstances that they had found themselves in. Drugs drive young women then, as now, to sell sex, and we have to accept that is a fact. And as such, they are too easily prey for violent, vicious killers like Naylor.
Naylor was finally back behind bars, but many people involved in the case feel that he should never have been freed to kill for a second time.
I don't think justice was served in the end, because he should never have got out from a killing having done 7.5 years, and Maureen should still be alive to this date because he should have been in prison.
The tragedy of this case is the warning signs were always there.
I think Naylor should have been stopped much earlier. There is no question in my mind that justice was not served, particularly in the case of Deborah. He was a man with, I believe, an evil gene, and a man who would not be satisfied unless he satisfied himself, and his objectives were always women, and therefore any woman that came across his bowels was in danger from him.
On the 17th of December 2021, George Naylor died of a brain aneurysm in HMP Frankland in Durham. He was 77 years old.
I suppose really only at that point did I really truly believe that he was no longer a danger to the public. And if George would have been released, even as an elderly man, I still think he would have had the potential to do harm to women. So in that context, the public no longer need to be in fear of George Naylor.
He's an insignificant, predatory killer who died where he should have been a lot sooner, in prison. I just want people to remember, behind the headlines are two young women who fell in with the wrong crowd as teenagers and met a man who was prepared to end their lives without a thought.
Naylor was a callous killer who bottled all the hatred he had for women and distilled it into the most shocking violence. After managing to avoid a murder conviction for killing Deborah Kershaw, his lust for brutality wasn't curbed in prison. And when Naylor was released early, he couldn't help but kill again, squeezing the life out of 18-year-old Maureen Stepan. leaving no doubt that George Naylor will forever be remembered as one of Britain's most evil killers.